The broadcaster that just pocketed $150 million of your money from Mark Carney's government is now spending its time telling you that the man who wants to cut off that check is dangerous, unhinged, and not to be trusted. Folks, if you cannot see the conflict of interest in that sentence, I genuinely do not know what to tell you. Sit down, pour yourself a coffee, because what is happening with the CBC right now is one of the most brazen rackets in the history of Canadian media. Let me paint the picture for you the way you would explain it to your buddy in a Canadian Tire parking lot on a Saturday morning. You are paying your neighbor's salary. Your neighbor's job is literally to say nice things about the guy who signs the checks. And the moment somebody shows up and says, "Hey, maybe we should stop paying our neighbor to do that," that neighbor dedicates their entire career to making that person look like a monster. That is the CBC. That is what is happening right now in Canada. Pierre Poilievre has been saying for years that the CBC does not cover conservatives fairly. Now look, I know not everyone loves the guy. I've said that before on this channel. But on this particular file, he is dead right. And the evidence is piling up faster than snow in a Manitoba February. Here's something that should knock your toque clean off your head. The CBC's own coverage consistently describes Poilievre using words like confrontational, populist, and aggressive. Read that back to yourself slowly. Confrontational, populist, aggressive. Now think about whether you have ever once seen CBC use those words to describe Mark Carney, a man who prorogued Parliament not once, but effectively twice in the span of a year, and handed his own party a $150 million gift to a broadcaster that then covers him favorably. If you can find me that headline, you send it my way. Now here is where it gets really rich. Just a few weeks ago, Poilievre went on the Joe Rogan Experience. 3 hours. Biggest podcast in the world. Over 20 million subscribers on YouTube alone. He sat there and made the case for Canadian workers, argued against American tariffs, talked about energy, talked about affordability. He gifted the man a kettlebell made in Calgary, which is honestly the most Canadian thing I have ever heard in my life. Joe Rogan, who is not exactly a soft touch, told him that the 51st state comment from Trump was, quote, a crazy thing to say, and called Poilievre a reasonable, intelligent person. Even Abacus Data, which is not exactly a right-wing outfit, found that after the Rogan interview, 56% of Canadians were aware it happened, and Poilievre's positives ticked upward. So how did CBC cover it? They fact-checked it. They assigned people to go through the interview and find things to nitpick. They ran multiple pieces questioning whether it helped him or hurt him. They brought in panel after panel to analyze whether the appearance was good or bad for his image. Not one of those panels was going out and fact-checking what Mark Carney said when he told Canadians a grocery benefit of $27 a week was bold action. Not a peep. But Poilievre goes on a podcast and talks to 20 million people about why Canadian workers deserve better, and the CBC newsroom sounds like a fire alarm went off. And look, I want to be clear about something. This is not just about opinions or feelings. There is a structural problem here that nobody in our mainstream press wants to talk about honestly. The CBC receives its funding through a parliamentary vote. The party in government controls that vote. Right now, the Carney Liberals just handed the CBC $150 million in new annual funding on top of the $1.4 billion they were already getting. That is not me editorializing. That is budget 2025. That is a matter of public record. So the broadcaster is now getting $1.55 billion a year from a government that Poilievre is trying to defeat. And we are all expected to believe that has absolutely zero effect on how they cover him. Give your head a shake, folks. Think about it like hockey night in Canada. Imagine the referee owned the arena. The arena was paid for by one team's budget. And that same team could vote every year on whether to give the referee a raise or cut their pay. Now imagine that referee calling a penalty on the other team every time they breathed wrong, and everyone acting surprised when the other team said the officiating might not be completely neutral. That is the CBC. That is the situation we are sitting in right now in this country. And here is what really gets me going, folks, because this is not ancient history. This is recent. The CBC ran a story about a Poilievre housing documentary and called it disinformation. Poilievre called them out publicly. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, that the CBC had been caught spreading disinformation about his own work, not the other way around. Now you tell me, when is the last time a major Canadian broadcaster ran a fact-check piece calling out a liberal policy document as disinformation? I will wait. There's also the matter of how CBC covered the Joe Rogan invitation back during the 2025 election campaign. Back then, Rogan offered Poilievre a seat. Poilievre's team reportedly passed. When he finally went in March of this year, CBC ran multiple pieces questioning the decision, questioning the platform, questioning the audience. But you know what they did not question? They did not question why Mark Carney went to Davos, stood in front of a room full of the richest people on the planet, and gave speeches about global architecture, while folks back home were stretching their grocery budget to the breaking point. Davos gets the royal treatment. Joe Rogan gets the skeptical eyebrow. Both are media appearances by political leaders, but only one of them gets treated like something slightly suspicious is going on. Now there is a crowd out there, and I know some of you have heard this argument, who says Pierre Poilievre has never produced hard data to back up the bias claim. Fair enough, I will give you that. But here's the thing, When your coverage literally and consistently frames one leader as confrontational and populist and aggressive, and frames the other as steady and experienced and measured, that is not neutral language. That is a choice. Somebody chose those adjectives. Somebody pitched those stories. Somebody decided which questions got asked and which ones did not. And while we are on the subject of questions that did not get asked, how come nobody in the CBC newsroom is asking why the government that just handed the broadcaster $150 million is the same government the broadcaster is supposed to hold accountable? That is not a gotcha question. That is the most basic journalism 101 question you could possibly ask. It is the kind of thing a first-year journalism student at Ryerson raises on day 2 of class. And yet here we are. Now, Poilievre has been pushing this week for a fuel tax holiday, which would take the GST and the excise tax off gas for the rest of the year as prices spike. His team says that would put over $5 billion back into the pockets of Canadians. Gas in Canada right now is running about 28 cents a litre higher in Canadian dollars than it is south of the border. 28 cents. For a family filling up twice a week, that adds up to real money. Poilievre was direct about it. He said it is not all global factors. Some of it is liberal taxes. Now you would think that would be the lead story. Man proposes putting money back in Canadians' pockets during a period of spiking fuel prices. But what does the CBC cover? They cover Carney's response to the proposal. They frame it through Carney's eyes. They make Carney the protagonist of a story that Poilievre originated. That is the pattern. Every single time. Poilievre acts. CBC reacts through a liberal lens. And they wonder why he will not give their reporters the time of day. Look, I am not sitting here saying every CBC journalist gets up in the morning and consciously decides to be unfair. I do not think it works like that. What I think happens is subtler, and in some ways more troubling. When your entire operating budget depends on the goodwill of one political party, when your new CEO just told Parliament that defunding would cripple the network, when the survival of your institution is literally tied to conservatives losing elections, you do not need a conspiracy. You just need human nature. People protect what protects them. That is not evil. It is just predictable. What is not predictable And what should genuinely alarm every single person in this country, regardless of how you vote, is the idea that we are supposed to trust a broadcaster in that exact situation to give us a fair picture of the man who threatens its existence. That is asking a lot. That is asking more than any institution in human history has ever been able to deliver. So when Poilievre says the coverage is not fair, what he is really saying is something a lot simpler and a lot more important. He is saying that Canadians deserve a press that is not financially beholden to one political outcome over another. He is saying that if you are going to call yourself a public broadcaster, you should actually answer to the public, not to the party that signs your checks. He is saying that $1.5 billion a year is a lot of money to spend on a newsroom that has a direct financial stake in how the next election turns out. And you know what? He is right. Not about everything, but about this. Because at the end of the day, the question is not whether Poilievre is too aggressive or too populist or too this or too that. The question is whether Canadians are getting honest information from an institution they are paying for. And when that institution just banked $150 million new dollars from the government whose opponents it is supposed to scrutinize equally, I think we are allowed to ask the question. I think we are not just allowed, I think we are obligated. This is your money, folks, every loony of it. And you deserve better than a newsroom that cannot cover the guy who wants to audit them without flinching.